Good evening and good morning. I'm happy to open our last event of the first day of the Poetry International Festival, number 3. Welcome again. And we're very happy to see you here. My name is Gilad Meiri, and I'm the director of the Poetry Place Festival. And with the poetess Noah Strakalji, which is here also with us. I'm honored to introduce Reut Ben Yaakov. You can say hello. Reut is a translator and a PhD student of Hebrew literature at the Hebrew University. She translated the novel Their Eyes Watch God by Zohar Neale Hurston, a novel that won the support of the Fund for Translation of Exemplary Literature. Essays, stories, and poems of her translation work have been published in the magazines Ho and Mayan, as well as books published by Nine Souls, Armchair, and the Fairy Project. Reut will host this event and shortly will present Kim Addonizio. But first, a reminder, your microphone will be muted during the event, but we will dedicate the last 10 minutes or so to your questions. And you may write them in the chat box during the event. And now I'm happy to pass the microphone to you, Reut, and wish you all a magical poetry tour.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gilad. I am very excited and happy to be here with you tonight, although online, of course. I first would like to thank the people that made the book, the series, and this meeting possible. Tangier Publishing House, Shlomi Khatuk, our editor-in-chief, Liron Alon, the translation editor, Sarah Sarig, our copy editor, and David Ben Arosh, our designer. Many thanks to Mifal Apais that assisted the publication of this book, and to Makom LeShira for initiating, offering, and making this event and this wonderful and so important festival. Thank you, Noga Komei, Noah Strakalji, Gilad Meiri, and more than anyone, of course, thank you, Kim Addonizio, for your poetry and for being here tonight with us. I will introduce Kim. Kim Addonizio is the author of 7 poetry collections, 2 novels, 2 story collections, and 2 books on writing poetry. Her poetry collection, Tell Me, was a finalist for the National Book Award. Addonizio's awards include 2 fellowships from the NEA, a Guggenheim, 2 Pushcart prizes, and other honors. Her poetry has been translated into several languages, including Spanish, Arabic, Italian, Hungarian, and Hebrew, of course. Her latest book of poems, Now We're Getting Somewhere, was published by W.W. Norton on March 2021. She lives in Oakland, California. Thank you very much, Kim. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm so excited that you are here. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Glad to be here with you all from so far away.
Yes, it is really an international meeting, I feel. I think that first we will open with reading 3 poems in English and in translation. We will have them also to see, right? If you see it, you could start with Generations, the first one.
Sure. This is my first chance to see and maybe my only chance to hear the Hebrew. So so thank you, Reut, and thanks to everyone at the press who made this possible. It's a very special thing to have not only people in your own country, but people elsewhere to read your words. So I'm going to read you this first poem, Generations, which is really about immigrants, and in this case about my sort of family history as coming from a family who immigrated from Italy. Generations. Somewhere a shop of hanging meats, shop of stink and blood, block and cleaver. Somewhere an immigrant, grandfather, stranger with my last name. That man untying his apron in 1910, scrubbing off the pale fat, going home past brownstones and churches, past vendors, streetcars, arias, past the clatter of supper dishes, going home to his new son, my father. What is he to me, butcher with sausage fingers, old Italian leaning over a child somewhere in New York City, somewhere alive? What is he that I go back to look for him years after his death and my father's death, knowing only a name, a few scraps my father fed me? My father who shortened that name, who hacked off 3 lovely syllables, who raised American children. What is the past to me that I have to go back, pronouncing that word in the silence of a cemetery? What is this stone coming apart in my hands like bread, name I eat and expel? Somewhere the smell of figs and brine, strung garlic, rosemary and olives. Somewhere that place. Somewhere a boat rocking, crossing over, entering the harbor. I wait on the dock, one face in a crowd of faces. Families disembark and stream toward the city, and though I walk among them for hours, hungry, haunting the streets, I can't tell which of them is mine. Somewhere a steak is wrapped in thick paper, somewhere my grandmother is laid in the earth, and my young father shines shoes on a corner, turning his back to the old world, forgetting. I walk the night city, looking up at lit windows, and there is no table set for me, nowhere I can go to be filled. This is the city of grandparents, immigrants, arrivals, where I've come too late with my name, an empty plate. This is the place.
Thank you.
And can I say, Reut, I'm seeing just you on my screen when I'm reading. Is that, don't know what other people are seeing. So I just wanted to mention that that's happening on my side.
You could go to the view
Mm-hmm.
up and ask for view side-by-side gallery.
Okay, maybe that's what I'm missing. Okay, there. Because I felt like I was reading to one person rather than at least some people. I know you're out there. It's just always hard to see you. So great, thank you.
דורות, אי שם חנות עם מתחי בשר תלויים בה, חנות של סרחון בדם, קרש חיתוך וסכין קצבים. אי שם מהגר, סבא, זר, ששם משפחתו הוא שם משפחתי. האיש הזה, שמתיר את קשר סינרו בשנת 1910, מקרצף את השומן החיוור, הולך הביתה וחולף על פני בניינים חומי לבנים, בכנסיות, חולף על פני דוכנים, חשמליות, אריות, על פני שקשוק כלי ארוחת הערב, הולך הביתה, אל התינוק החדש שנולד לו, אבא שלי. מהו בשבילי? קצב עם אצבעות נקניק, איטלקי זקן מתכופף מעל ילד אי שם בניו יורק סיטי, אי שם ובחיים, מהו? שאני חוזרת כדי לחפש אותו. שנים לאחר שהוא כבר מת, ואבא שלי כבר מת, יודעת רק מה שמו, וכמה פירורי מידע שאבא שלי סיפר לי. אבא שלי שקיצר את השם ההוא, שקיצץ 3 הברות נאות, שגידל ילדים אמריקאים. מהו העבר בשבילי, שאני צריכה לחזור, הוגה את המילה הזאת, בשקט ששורר בבית קברות. מהי האבן הזו שמתפרקת בידי כמו לחם, שם שאני אוכלת ויורקת. אי שם ריח תאנים ומים מלוכים, מקלעת שום, רוזמרין וזיתים. אי שם ישנו המקום הזה, אי שם אונייה, מתנודדת, חוצה, נכנסת לנמל. אני מחכה, על הרציף, פרצוף אחד בתוך קהל הפרצופים. משפחות יורדות ונוערות אל העיר, ואף שאני הולכת ביניהן במשך שעות, רעבה, רודפת את הסמטאות, אינני יודעת להבדיל מי מהן היא שלי. אי שם, נתח בשר נעטף בנייר עבה. אי שם סבתא שלי נטמנת באדמה, ואבי הצעיר מצחצח נעליים בפינת רחוב, מפנה את גבו אל העולם הישן, שוכח. אני צועדת בעיר הלילית, מביטה מעלה אל חלונות מוארים, ואין שום שולחן ערוך לכבודי, אין שום מקום שאליו אני יכולה ללכת להתמלא. זוהי העיר של הסבים והסבתות, המהגרות, המגיעים. לשם הגעתי, מאוחר מדי עם השם שלי. צלחתי ריקה. זהו המקום.
Okay. This is called What to Save from the Fire. And you probably, I don't know, maybe you don't know the story. There's a sort of famous philosophical question. If there was a burning house and your grandmother was in there and a valuable painting by Picasso, which would you save? Sort of a philosophical question. So this is what to save from the fire. Grandma offed herself years ago, so that just leaves the Picasso. But it turns out to be a pencil drawing you made at 6. Triangle of a sail, one duck on a squiggle of water. Up go the curtains in a bright rush. You'd definitely save your daughter and take her place on the pyre, but she moved to a faraway island after launching a few thousand ships. Once you left a throw rug on a floor heater to keep the darts you were throwing from falling in, and woke to a room made of smoke. But all that burned was the rug, so it didn't count, the way nothing counted back then. You and your friends carrying blankets and pillows outside to sleep and opening all the windows. Fire is fed by air, a slim lick of flame expanding like most people in middle age. What about your journals? Pages of proof you never changed, no matter what the mirror tells you. Years from now, someone might lick the ink and taste snow, cheap wine, the grilled cheeses you ate with your mother at the Woolworths counter. Then again, look at those rosettes of self-pity adorning the cake of your depression. Let the journals burn. Meanwhile, better wet a towel and hold it to your face. Who's coming for you? Hopefully large men in helmets and boots, and not a few students exhuming a metaphor. Stay calm. Throw darts. Some look like cruise missiles, some like honeybees.
מה להציל מהשריפה? סבתא התאבדה לפני שנים, ומתברר שהפיקאסו הוא רישום בעיפרון שציירת בגיל 6, משולש כמפרס, ברווז על פני שרבוט גלי של מים. הנה הווילונות מתקלים בבהילות בוהקת. את בלי ספק תצילי את הבת שלך, ותקחי את מקומה במדורה. אך היא עברה לאי מרוחק לאחר השטת 1,000 אוניות בים. פעם אחת השארת שטיחון על פתח החימום ברצפה כדי שהחיצים לא יפלו פנימה, והתעוררת לחדר שכולו עשוי עשן. אבל כל מה שנשרף היה השטיח, ולכן זה לא נחשב, כמו שכלום לא נחשב בימים ההם. את והחברים שלך לקחתם שמיכות וכריות החוצה כדי לישון, ופתחתם את כל החלונות. שריפה מוזנת על ידי אוויר, לשון אש דקיקה תופחת, כמו רוב האנשים בגיל המעבר. ומה לגבי היומנים שלך? דפים שלמים של הוכחות שלא השתנית אף פעם, לא משנה מה המראה מספרת לך. בעוד שנים רבות מעכשיו, מישהו אולי ילקק את הדיו ויבחין בטעם של שלג, יין זול, הטוסטים עם הגבינה שאכלת עם אמא שלך בדלפק בוורור. אבל יחד עם זאת, הביטי בקישוטי הרחמים העצמיים המאתרים את עוגת הדיכאון שלך. הניחי ליומנים לבעור, בינתיים, עדיף שתרטיבי מגבת ותצמידי אותה לפנים שלך. מי מגיע לעזרתך? בתקווה גברים גדולי ממדים עם קסדות ומגפיים, ולא כמה סטודנטים שמחלצים מטאפורה. הישארי רגועה, השליחי חיצים. חלקם נראים כמו טילי שיוט, חלקם כמו דבורי דבש.
And this is called Florida. And then there was the man who said, "You look fatter with your clothes off." And like a fool, I didn't put them back on. but climbed into his bed beneath the little Tibetan prayer flags and several images of Buddha haloed by a white light I wished at that moment to dematerialize into, especially when he asked me to get on top, but facing away from him, so that I rose up and slid down, looking at the knees and naked feet of someone whom an hour ago I'd found attractive. In a way, I realized it was now a blessing not to have to look into his eyes, but still, being fucked backwards while facing a stain on the wall that resembled Florida was not quite the encounter I'd envisioned, standing in the bookstore that the Beats with their Blakean visions and wholly passionate excesses had made famous. And my mind began to wander in order to avoid being present for whatever was going on down there, eternally it seemed. And was that really his penis? It felt like a speculum as he groaned, and I gazed at Florida, thinking of orange groves and all the nights in Pompano Beach my brothers and I played lighthouse tag, dodging the beam that swept over the black sea and pale sand. And of all the days I spent shirtless, climbing palm trees or squatting with a stick over a washed up blue translucent man-o'-war quivering in the wind. And of the time I dug a sand pit, hoping to trap my crazy violent older brother, anchoring the sharp swords of sticker plants upright in the bottom, covering the hole with a blanket and just enough sand. And how was I going to lure him in there? Maybe I could get him to chase me. He was always chasing me. I could feel my anger and the great happiness of impending revenge, imagining him falling in, wishing I could cover him over and bury him forever, while somewhere in the orange-scented light of a candle in the universe behind me, my lover finished, and I closed my eyes and never, until now, turned around to look at him, sinking beneath the surface of the bed like a drowning sailor thrown overboard from a great ship that centuries ago rounded the Cape and sailed on to another world.
פלורידה. ואז היה הגבר ההוא שאמר, את נראית יותר שמנה בלי בגדים. וכמו טיפשה אני לא לבשתי אותה מיד חזרה, אלא נכנסתי איתו למיטה שמעליה תלויים דגלי תפילה טיבטיים, וכמה פסלי בודה מוקפים בהילה של תאורה לבנה. ייחלתי באותו הרגע להתפרק מקיום מוחשי ולהיטמע בה, במיוחד כשהוא ביקש ממני שאהיה מעליו, אבל שאפנה לאחור ולא אליו. אז התרוממתי וזזתי למטה, כשמבטי נח על ברכיים וכפות רגליים ערומות, של מישהו שלפני שעה חשבתי שהוא מושך. איכשהו הבנתי, איזו ברכה זו שעכשיו אני לא צריכה להסתכל לו בעיניים. ובכל זאת, להידפק מאחור ולהסתכל על כתם על הקיר בצורת פלורידה, זה לא בדיוק המפגש כפי שחזיתי אותו. כשעמדתי בחנות הספרים שמשוררי דור הביט הפכו למפורסמת, עם חזונותיהם ברוח וויליאם בלייק וההגזמות הקדושות מלאות התשוקה. והמוח שלי התחיל לשוטט כדי להימנע מלהיות ממש שם, ומה שזה לא יהיה שהתרחש שם למטה ונמשך לנצח כמדומה. ובאמת, זה היה הזין שלו, זה הרגיש כאילו זה ספקולום. כשהוא גנח ואני בהיתי בפלורידה וחשבתי על פרדסים עם תפוזים, ועל כל הלילות בפומפנו ביץ' עם האחים שלי, שהאחים שלי ואני שיחקנו תופסת מגדלור, מתחמקים מקרן האור המשוטטת על פני הים השחור והחול החיוור. ועל כל הימים שבהם התהלכתי בלי חולצה, טיפסתי על תקלים או השתופפתי עם מקל, מעל שלפוחן מצוי, כחול שקוף ורוטט ברוח שנסחף אל החוף. ועל אז כשחפרתי בור בחול וקיוויתי להפיל בו את אחי הגדול המטורף והאלים, טמנתי בקרקעית את חרבותיהם החדות של העצבים הקוצניים עם הלהבים כלפי מעלה. וכיסיתי את הבור בשמיכה וקצת חול בדיוק במידה הנכונה, ואיך התכוונתי לפתות אותו לבוא לשם, אולי אוכל לגרום לו לרדוף אחריי. והוא תמיד רדף אחריי, יכולתי להרגיש את הכעס שלי ואת האושר האדיר של הנקמה המתקרבת. מדמיינת אותו נופל פנימה, מקווה שאוכל לחסות אותו ולקבור אותו לנצח, בזמן שאיפשהו באור הנר בניחוח תפוז ביקום שמאחוריי, המאהב שלי גמר ואני עצמתי עיניים, ואף פעם, עד עכשיו, לא הסתובבתי להביט בו, שוקע מתחת לפני השטח של המיטה כמו מלאך טובר, שהושלך מסיפונה של ספינה ענקית, אשר לפני מאות בשנים הקיפה את הכס והפליגה הלאה לעולם אחר. Thank you. It was, I think, very beautiful. Well, first, I would like to ask you, maybe generally, how and what are you doing these days in regarding to poetry and in any other aspect that you would like to share with us?
I'm not doing a lot of writing right now. I'm trying to get back to doing some writing after publishing the last book. So mostly I'm learning the banjo, which I fell in love with. And so been really involved with music in a lot of ways, and working on doing some poems and music with a guitarist. And you'll be hearing some of that towards the end of things. But yeah, that's what I've been doing, just like everybody else, sort of living through the pandemic and hunkered down a lot, not going too many places. So
yes, those are really weird times.
Yeah.
Yes. I would like to speak a little bit, talk a little bit about the poems that we've read or the themes that they carry. The book in Hebrew is titled, as I told you, What to Save from the Fire, מה להציל מהשרפה. And we chose this name as we saw fire in your poems again and again. And I want to ask you about this theme, the standpoint of facing the fire, and the question which repeats, namely, what will you or anyone would have saved? I know that you said it, the philosophical aspect of it, but can you tell us something about this fire?
Well, it's funny because I hadn't noticed that there are a lot of poems about fire. You don't always notice those things about your own work. Somebody once asked me, what is your thing about fish? Because apparently I have a lot of fish in my poems too. So yeah, fire. Well, now of course we're, with climate change, we're just living with a lot more extreme conditions like that. So here in California, there's just been a real awareness of that because we're, most of our state was burning last year during the fire season. And in the house I lived in, my roommate who owned the house sold it because the fires, we were in a fire zone because we were in the woods, and she didn't want her house that was her only thing she had, and she didn't want it to burn down. She wanted to leave before that happened. So I think that that's causing a lot of people to, rethink what they're doing and where they're living. And so I don't know, I think it's been, I guess it's just a metaphor, like everything, it's a metaphor for the fire of life and being forged in the fire, and the fire of mortality, and the fact that we're all one day going into the flames one way or another. So I guess that operates differently in different poems, but it's not something that I'm consciously aware of thinking about or really having front and center, So like I said, it's always interesting when someone else sees things that you don't, and it turns out they're there.
Yes, it is very interesting. I thought about it as the saving from the fire thing is present in, I think, 3 of the poems in our book, in the Hebrew book, also in the introduction to poetry and in the givens that we will read later. And there are also like the self-fascinating from the fire and the scrapbook. This is me in love with the beauty of blue glass in flames. So, and I personally was wondering if maybe it is also related to the question of being a mother and a daughter in your poetry, also with the theme of generations that we just read. And maybe I think about it because now it is even more, it echoes what we sadly see now more in the news every day, people fleeing from their homes that are indeed under fire, and who and what they are carrying with them to save. So
yeah. Yeah, well, you know, when it comes down to it, there's nothing really more important than people. I mean, you know, like everything else they're just things, right? They're just possessions and they don't really matter. Maybe that's just a, you know, we have a more acute awareness of that. There's nothing really that you would want to save but the people that you love, or maybe your cat. your the living things, right? The living, breathing things are the things that matter, and the earth itself, of course, is a living thing that we are destroying. So yeah, I don't know personally what I'd try to grab if I had 10 minutes to leave, but probably not that much, you know, probably, you know, my lover and my animal, and that would be it, because everything else is, you can start over.
yes, hopefully.
And I'm grateful not to be in that position, you know, right now anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, in continuation to this, but maybe from a different angle, in a very beautiful review of the book in Yediot Achronot, the critic and poet Eli Hirsch wrote, and I've translated a few lines of it. I will read them. So you will also hear it, and also maybe you would like to say a few things. The American poet Kim Addonizio has an obsession for the multiple, for what repeats like a loop, happens again and again to one person, but also to many people. In her poem, What to Save from the Fire, Addonizio seemingly takes the opposite lane, asking what is the one thing to save when the fire threatens to take everything. Then the poem offers a series of deliberately failing answers. In the end, the answer is almost self-explanatory. Save yourself. Save yourself so you could yearn again, burn again, and be saved once more. And here, the obsessive side in her poetry is revealed, wonderful and horrifying at the same time, in the understanding that this is exactly what we are, phoenixes rising again and again from their ashes, from their mourning and decay. This is the source of the multiplicity. And he continues, Addonizio's special sensitivity to the multiple puts her in a special position within the poetic tradition. It allows her to exceed from the mainly masculine value system, a system that tends to sanctify the uniqueness. So I was wondering first, do you agree? And how do you think of this idea of the multiple that goes like negatively to the What to Save from the Fire, and that is shown in the poems as both marvelous and terrifying? I think so too.
It's really interesting to hear that. You know, I haven't thought about things in those terms, but I like that concept of the multiple and the sort of, it just seems to me that's what life is. It's all of it, right? It's not one thing or the other. It's not light or dark. It's both. They're often intermixed. And so wherever you are in the world, or whoever you are, I don't think of it as particularly masculine, though. The last bit of that about that's masculine to have. I think you said something about privileging the uniqueness. Or
he was saying that usually, yes, privileging the uniqueness is masculine, and to talk about the multiple or the multiplicity is a way to criticize it, or to add a different angle of more feminine, he would maybe say.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating perspective. You know, I really have to think about whether I agree with it or not. But I, you know, I think we all look at, we all derive different things from poems, and that's a good thing, right? You know, it doesn't mean just one thing to one person. If you have 20 people listening to a poem, they're going to hear 20 different poems because of who they are. So so that's fascinating to me. It's something I'm just going to think about for a while and see. I'm really curious to see whether I really have done that in other poems. But then, sometimes it's always part of writing. I imagine there are a number of people here at this event that are writers or readers of poetry. And it's always sort of fascinating to me to see all the ways that poems can be sort of multivalent, and go out in different directions and enter us from different points in terms of where we are in our experience. So, I think it's a great concept to think about multiplicity. And what does that mean in a poem? And that means multiple meanings. It means multiple levels of understanding, multiple doors into whatever the poem might be saying to us. And it's going to open some doors for some people and other doors for others. So I think it's a great sort of way to, like a little prism, that you can look at a poem as a prism and look at all of the different facets of it. And depending where you're standing and who you are, it's going to look like different things. So,
yeah, for sure. Yeah. So maybe we will talk about the poem Florida that we've read before, which I personally love very much and was very happy that you suggested that we will read it here. Opens a discussion about a very fundamental issue in your poetry, I believe, your critical approach to ideas that we now call slut shaming, and the feeling that the poems, that your poems open more spaces for being women. And also the critical approach to the conventions of poetry, as you put it in the poem Introduction to Poetry, no one should say that in a poem. And of course, you do that. You say it in poems again and again. As you were, I think, one of the first to talk about those things in poetry in these days, in these ways, maybe you could tell us a bit about it. First, how was it to writing like this in the 1990s, firstly, and what responses did you receive? And did you have a moment, a specific moment that you decided to tell poetry that you don't agree with the conventions? When you knew that poetry is actually the genre to say, and I quote again, fuck, shit, love, now right?
Well, yeah, well, there's a lot of questions there and a lot of sort of implications of what you've just said. I think it comes down to maybe you said slut shaming.
Yes, but anti-slut shaming.
Yeah. I guess that's sort of a far end of the spectrum. That I really think of it as just it's just women's sexuality. I think it's just the way that women's sexuality is viewed and has been circumscribed and tamped down, and that it's maybe threatening on some level. I don't think it's new. You can go back to Sappho and hear very unabashed female desire and female sexuality, at least from the fragments that we can put together, So I think that it's not that it hasn't always been there as some kind of a thread in poetry, but certainly if you look at, say, Western culture and women's rights and women's liberation and all of that, you can sort of you can think about it as something somewhat newer, maybe since the 70s, the second wave of feminism, in the 70s in the US anyway, where a lot of women were sort of claiming, just claiming themselves, sort of, and I think that continues, and I think there's a real sort of holdover from, at least in America, coming from a sort of puritanical tradition that this country was founded on, that makes it problematic. But women's roles all over the world are clearly problematic, problematic for people that then make them problematic for women. So, and I think, to me, it's a little strange that poetry should somehow have some sort of a sense of these rules or protocols or norms that involve some sort of extreme decorum, as though that's what poetry is, right? Like, oh, well, you're not supposed to say certain words in poems. You're not supposed to have a certain kind of persona in a poem. And I don't understand that concept that decorum is the thing that should be governing us as poets. I think as poets, we're trying to talk about being alive in the world, being a conscious, mortal human being, struggling and trying to live as authentically as we can live, and at least those, the good people. The evil people, we know who they are, and they're trying to smash all that and destroy it, which is why there are cultures that prevent dancing and prevent music, because those are things that are part of the human spirit. And, authoritarian regimes want to shut that down because they understand that they're integral to who we are as human beings, and they're as necessary as anything else that we do. So, I guess, to me, there's not some sort of a line that gets crossed or that I'm trying to cross at all. It's just, I'm just trying to express my own sense of what I see and what I think about, and trying to put it out, and hopefully, other people might respond to it in some way and maybe find some sense of kinship or solace in that. And it's always sort of amusing and maddening when people, often male people, say to me something like, "You're crossing a line," or "This is," they get really bothered. And I don't really, it doesn't make sense to me that happens, but it does. And that's the world, yeah. So I guess that's my response to that.
But did you in the past receive responses like that? Like, you shouldn't do that? Or do you remember things like that? Or
yeah, oh yeah, that's that's happened to me quite often. Even from like young students, I've had them say to me, "Ms. Addonizio, why is your work so nasty?" Like they hear a word and they think that that's nasty, or I'm writing about some subject that they feel is nasty. And my response is, well, the world is, the world is all these things. And if you're an artist of any kind, I think your job is to engage with the world in some way. And that's what we traffic in, are the truths of the world. And I think it was the writer Colette, the French writer Colette, who said, look hard at what you love and harder at what you don't love, harder at what disturbs you. And so I think, especially writers who actually write about things and who work in this medium of language, which is a very communicative medium, whereas like music can be something that is wordless. And so I think it has a different relationship to meaning, but as writers, I think we are saying things and making meaning, and part of our job is to talk about the truths of the world. And some of those are just difficult on whatever level. And that whether that's, some sexual thing on the one hand, or murder on the other. So, so I don't understand the concept that we're supposed to wall off certain things. And, I mean, I'm not setting out to offend anybody, but I'm okay if I do sometimes, because it's not my job not to offend anyone. It's my job to say what I have to say. And I think that's true of any artist.
Yes, specifically in this, I think I find in this specific poem, Florida, also not just saying it, but also I think it goes through a beautiful and heartbreaking path of connecting the present moment of the poem with the history of being hurt and being treated in some ways abusively as a child. And I think that what this poem, what you do in this poem, is also giving some kind of a feeling of that the dissociation from the present moment, give it some kind of a mythological meaning, or and connecting it to maybe childish, but not only desire of revenge. I think it is done very beautifully here, mythologizing it and connecting the dots through this very often sense of dissociation.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, and at the end, he's sinking beneath the waves.
Yeah.
So it's hopefully in the end it's an empowering poem, and hopefully it's also funny.
It is also funny. I hope so, that it is also a bit funny in Hebrew, but yes.
Yeah, good. I'm glad. It's intended to be funny as well, because where are we if we can't laugh? We're doomed.
Yeah. This has lots of irony and also just humor with this Florida and the flags and everything is beautiful. I think I'm not aware of the time, but I think that we should soon go to read more. But I would also like to ask you first, maybe a little bit of a general question about American poetry today in comparison to the 1990s, when you have started publishing your poetry. Where do you see some kind of trend shifted or shifting to? And in your experience, are there changes in the popular status of poetry or the status of being a poet? Do you feel something like that?
It's hard for me to say because I'm just looking out my own little window, and I don't think I have a lot to say about the state of American poetry in general. I do feel like that there's been some more sort of greater cultural awareness of it, that I think poetry sort of is like this underground river that sometimes all of a sudden it springs up and there's a fountain and people notice it and they go, oh, look at that. That's really, wow, poetry. And then it kind of goes back down and it keeps going along in the culture, and it's there all the time to me as like this underground river. And then it's just very interesting when it sort of comes up into a more popular consciousness or a more, larger number of people start to notice it in some way. And that is something that I think has risen and fallen a couple of 3 times since the 90s, where people sort of notice it and pay attention to it. And it happens, I think, in the individual life too, because when are people aware of poetry who are not generally aware of it? Usually in either a moment of great joy or great sorrow, right? When you're at a wedding, what do? You read a poem. At a funeral or a memorial service, you read a poem, because poetry speaks to those urgent times in our lives, whether they're happy or terrible urgencies. And I think that's when almost everyone realizes that there is something of value in poetry for them, and then the rest of the time, there are a few of us in that river, and I think that's actually okay. It's certainly in America, it's not in the kind of center that it has been in, say, some Latin American countries. I don't really know what it's like in Israel, but I know that, in some Latin American countries, it's definitely been more at the center of the culture for even, just anyone who's just walking around, and not this sort of specialty or not this academic specialty as it has tended to be with the universities lately, in the past 40 years or so in America. So anyway, yeah, but I like thinking of it that way and not worrying too much about its place, because I think it's always there.
I really love this concept. Yes,
yes. This is the time for the last 3 poems that you wanted to read, and rock and roll, right? And we have
yeah.
Do we have time for the 3 or just 2?
We'll start with the 2, and we'll
and
see.
Then we'll see. Okay, so now name that means whole in Greek.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to invite my partner, whose name is Danny Karen, to accompany me on this one. me just get us in here and see if people can see you. I think the gallery. I don't know if anybody can see Danny or not right now. He's here. Oh yeah, there you
We
are.
can see half of me.
A little bit that way. How's that? Is that better? Okay.
Oh, they don't want to see me anyway.
Yeah. Well, sure they do. Okay, so I have a little introduction.
We surely do.
I have a little introduction to this poem first, because my daughter's name is Aya, A-Y-A, which does relate to Greek. The doesn't exactly mean holy, but it's close. Anyway, her father and I named her out of a baby naming book called A Jewish Child is Born, because her father's Jewish. We converted her as a baby with a Reformed rabbi, and her Shiksa mother did a lot of the Shabbat stuff with her on Fridays, and so I sort of became an honorary Jew, and so we found this name Aya in the baby naming book, which was translated as bird, and we thought it was a beautiful name. And as I'm sure you all know, it's a kind of small hawk called a kite, but it turns out to have meanings in a lot of other languages, and that's really what this poem is about. So, right. All right, so this is name that means holy in Greek for Aya. Today I heard your name shouted by a short order cook, flipping scallion pancakes in a grease-grimed Chinese restaurant. He said it meant wow, which is the best word I know for the unutterable sublime. Wow is how I had the dumb luck to become your young and terrified mother, not knowing how to hold you in the hospital parking lot while your father got the car. It seemed to take a long time. Wow, it seemed to take 10 minutes for you to get your driver's license and move away to New York. I remember the moment we made you and knew we had, your father lifting himself up off the bed and laughing. Little hawk, Sumerian goddess, Kachina that races the wind. The verses of the Quran are ayahs. In Japanese, full of color or beauty, the once inked for me as tomorrow's arrow. The secret ingredient in the chef's special, a marinade containing Aya. First word spoken by a rose, last word the trees say at night as they lie down in the forests and fields. Last sound I'll make if I can still speak at the end. My palindrome, sword, storm, wind.
Wow, that was beautiful.
Thanks, sweetheart.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now is Danny Karen. I got lucky on Match.com to meet a professional guitarist who likes to accompany poets. So
Great. I feel a little weird to just read it in Hebrew after that, but okay, I will do that.
do.
שם שביוונית משמעו קדוש, לאיה. היום שמעתי את שמך נאמר בצעקה, מפיו של עובד מטבח, שטיגן פנקק בצל ירוק במסעדה, סינית מטונפת משמן. הוא אמר שהמשמעות היא וואו, וזאת המילה הכי טובה שאני מכירה, להתייחס לנשגב שאין להביאו במילים. וואו, זה היותר מזל משכל שהיה לי, להפך לאמא הצעירה והמפוחדת שלך, שלא ידע איך להחזיק אותך, במגרש החנייה של בית החולים, שאבא שלך הלך להביא את המכונית. היה נדמה שזה לקח המון זמן. וואו, נדמה שזה לקח לך בדיוק 10 דקות, עד שהוצאת את רישיון הנהיגה שלך, ועברת לניו יורק. אני זוכרת את הרגע שבו עשינו אותך, וידענו את זה, אבא שלך התרומם ויצא מהמיטה וצחק. נץ קטן, אלה שומרת, קצ'ינה מהירה מן הרוח. סוכי הקוראן הם איית, צורת הרבים של איה. ביפנית מלאת צבע או יופי. אף שזה פעם קועקע עליי כחץ המחר. המרכיב הסודי במנת השף, מרינדה בתוספת איה. המילה הראשונה שיאמר פרח הוורד. המילה האחרונה שהעצים אומרים בלילה בשוכבם ביערות ובשדות. הצליל האחרון שאני אשמיע, אם עדיין אוכל לדבר בסוף. פלינדרום שלי, חרב, רוח שערה.
Beautiful. So I think, yeah, we're going to end with this one.
From the new book, right?
This is from this new book called Now We're Getting Somewhere. Yeah. But you can find it on all over the internet, it seems like. So this is really for any woman who's been in a bathroom and either been this woman or heard this woman, as I bet we all have. To the woman crying uncontrollably in the next stall. If you ever woke in your dress at 4 a.m., ever closed your legs to someone you loved, opened them for someone you didn't, moved against a pillow in the dark, stood miserably on a beach, seaweed clinging to your ankles, paid good money for a bad haircut, backed away from a mirror that wanted to kill you, bled into the back seat for lack of a tampon. If you swam across a river under rain, sang using a dildo for a microphone, stayed up to watch the moon eat the sun entire, ripped out the stitches in your heart because why not? If you think nothing and no one can, listen, I love you. Joy is coming.
לאישה שבוכה בכי בלתי נשלט בתא הסמוך. לאישה. אם אי פעם התעוררת בשמלה שלך ב4 בבוקר, אי פעם סגרת את הרגליים שלך בפני מישהו שאהבת, פתחת אותן, בפני מישהו שלא, התחככת על כרית בחשיכה, עמדת אומללה על חוף ים, עצות דבוקות לקרסולייך, שילמת במיטב כספך על תספורת גרועה, נרתעת לאחור מפני מראה שניסתה להרוג אותך, דיממת על המושב האחורי כי לא היה לך טמפון, עם חצית בשחייה נהג כשגשם ירד, שרת אל דילדו כמו אל מיקרופון, נשארת ערה כדי לראות את הירח, אוכלת השמש כל כולה, קראת את התפרים של הלב שלך, כי למה לא? אם את חושבת ששום דבר ואף אחד לא יכול, תקשיבי, אני אוהבת אותך, האושר בדרך.
So there was one question from the crowd, from the audience. What is your approach as a poet to your heritage or to the poetry heritage? They mentioned the beats and others. It's a very big question, yeah, but it's a question.
Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of wonderful dead writers that I'm in touch with, and just inspired by, and so I think the beats were fairly important to me when I started writing, but I sort of came to poetry not knowing anything. Was just sort of struck by it as if by lightning. And then I had to learn what it meant to become a poet and how to do that and how to jump in the river basically and find my fellow swimmers and, the rafts that they offered along the way. And so there are a lot of, writers that have been important to me in the past. And I guess some of them would be Walt Whitman and John Keats and Gerard Manley Hopkins and Yeats, and the early Chinese poets were very important to me when I started writing in translation by Kenneth Rexroth, because they were just so sort of their language, when you're translating Chinese, speaking of translation, into English, it's sort of sounds at least like a very pared down, simple language. And so I found those poems really spoke to me, even though they were written centuries ago. And I think the greatest poets do that. They just speak to you through the centuries, and Shakespeare and everyone else from every tradition, Rumi. And I could go on and name poet after poet after poet, because there's so many of them that that at one time or another have been important to me or have spoken to me. And I think that the best thing is for those of you who are writing poetry or perhaps learning poetry, as some of you undoubtedly are, is to really just find the writers who are your guiding lights. Find the poets who really speak to you, and just follow them, wherever they lead, and read them and study them and try to see how they do what they do, and then create your own version of it. So, everyone I've read has been important to me in some way or another. Even reacting against certain writers has been important to me, just to say, oh, I don't want to be like that, or that's not my project to write in that way. So as much as you can, the filmmaker Fellini said, live spherically. And I love that concept. So I would say live spherically in all directions and read in the same way.
In spirituality, it really doesn't matter if you're a male or a man or a woman. There's one soul. But you mentioned all male poets. And it was very interesting to listen to these great, phenomenal poets, the Beats and Rumi. And I wanted to ask you, what are the women poets that you feel a deep connection to?
Yeah, well, I mentioned Sappho earlier, and then I would also say Edna St. Vincent Millay, who was just, I love her sonnets. I love her work. I think she was really ahead of her time. She wasn't considered so at the time, but I think she really was. I would say Elizabeth Bishop is another one who's been important to me. Sharon Olds, more contemporary writer, important in reading her and feeling like I could say what I wanted to say. I think she was a writer who, when I read her, I went, oh, you can say that in a poem? Okay, great. But there are, novelists also who are important to me in that respect. Kathy Acker, for example, much more experimental writer. But also reading her, I just thought, oh, you really can. This is a space of freedom to write. And so I think those are some of the women that inspired me and gave me that sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Reut, is there anything else?
There is another question Shlomi wants to ask. So please, Shlomi.
All right, maybe two very short. The first one is there was a time that you understood that you have your own voice, because each one of us love to follow poets or authors, but I think the achievement is to have your own voice. Did you notice this do you remember this moment? And the second one is, I think it's the poem Generations. The two first lines, you're talking about your grandfather. I don't have this in English. Maybe Reut can write these two lines from Generations. You're talking about Meatloaf's on his store with blood and knives. I will read it in Hebrew just for a second. אי שם חנות עם נתחי בשר תלויים בה, חנות של סרחון ודם, קרש חיתוך וסכין קצבים. Well, you're talking about your grandfather, but in the second or third time I wrote it, I thought it's maybe a metaphor about poetry, and maybe especially about poets who don't think too, I mean, you write a lot about your lovers, a lot about your family and your close friends. And I would think about how it makes you feel when you think this is something that inevitable to put them in my poetry. And I thought it was a very, very nice metaphor for, the butcher, because all of us almost all the time writes about people we loved. And sometimes we can hurt them by doing this.
Let me start with your second comment, and then I'll go back to the voice question. That's a perfect example of like what we read and what we take from it and what the writer puts there and why it's different for everyone. I mean, I didn't intend it as a metaphor, actually. I just intended it literally as my grandfather was a butcher in New York City, and that the place that he lived and survived and came to America was this butcher shop. So I never thought of it as a metaphor. And maybe my subconscious was doing more than I know, just as in the multiplicity of things, so it was really just meant to be this place, this shop, so I think that's really interesting. But in terms of people in my life and writing about them and whether it hurts them or not, I believe in kindness. I think kindness should be written on everyone's forehead in lipstick, like at the end of that Jane Campion movie. But I also think we all have the need and sometimes even obligation to tell our own stories. And inevitably other people are involved in those stories, but they have a right to tell their stories too, So my thing is not that no one should silence themselves, but also, you want to consider do no harm as well. So, but I'm also not here necessarily to safeguard everyone either, so it's complicated, right? So somewhere in that, different people err in different places. Some people won't write about their children or won't write about who they're with, and I just do. I'm sorry, that's me, and I do it, but the only person I've really worried about, since mostly I became a poet after my parents were either not alive or not in a state to really pay any attention to my work, I never really had to worry about what my parents thought. There was one poem about my mother that I sort of very carefully took out of the book before I gave it to her, so that she wouldn't notice a page was missing, because I didn't think she would like that vision of herself when she was very old and ill. And I didn't want to hurt her with that depiction. But I still wrote it and published it.
I think that someone actually asked for us to read it. The poem, The Moment.
Oh, it wasn't that one, actually.
Okay.
It was a different one about her helping her out of the bathtub when she was older. So, but on the other hand, when she, I don't want to go too long with this story, but another poem I read her from that book was about my brother dying of, or it's about my brother's liver transplant. And I read it to my mother in the mental ward of a hospital, because she was very old and had dementia and had been taken there for various mishaps. Anyway, we were there. She wanted to hear a poem. I read her that poem and she started crying. And I thought, oh my God, I've made a terrible mistake. I've hurt her. I've made her feel bad. And a day later, when I was there with her again, she said, read me that poem again. So, there's so many ways people might respond, but, so I've basically said, yeah, I think it's an issue for a lot of people. And I think you want to walk the line between not hurting people, but also not censoring yourself for what you've come to say. And I'll just say briefly about the voices that I don't know if I have found my voice. I keep finding the voice of the poem as it wants to speak to me. And that's the way I feel about it now, that there are different voices. And that the voice of the poem is one of the most critical things that I think about when I'm writing, trying to find the voice of that particular poem. And sometimes I'll rewrite a poem that has the same sort of imagery in it, but I know the tone is wrong. I know I haven't found the voice to tell the images in the right way. And that's about as best as I can explain it. But I think for me, it's a really kind of fundamental subject to think about the voice and how is the story or the idea going to be told.
I wish to thank you, Kim, and I wish to thank you, Reut, it was very quick. It was 10 minutes. This is how it felt. It was so interesting and sweet. And Kim, I must tell you that your book and the translation was welcomed really well here in Israel. And it's something that you can't feel if you don't live here. But there was a great applause and a reception for your book. So we're very happy that you were with us this evening. And I want to thank you all for being with us. And I want to invite you tomorrow for the second day of our festival, as we start at 6 o'clock p.m. Israel time. It will be a pleasure to host Howard Altman and Tal Mitzan for the first event of the day. And I wish you all a good night and a safe drive to your bed from, the salon.
Thank you so much for having me, really. Thank you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.